Hi everyone. So I've been invited by a project called Fragments of Self to talk about my life, and in particular to talk about specific fragments of my life, fragments mentioned, written on these scraps of paper. I'm going to start with the first one, which is this: childhood. And I'm assuming that they're interested in knowing about my childhood. Now, I've bored a lot of people to death already about my childhood, and I've written about it in various books and have included all my recollections in an anthology called Childhood. I grew up in England mostly at a very beautiful Regency house in the southeast called Langton House, and it's near a town called Tunbridge Wells, which was fashionable in the 17th century for taking the well water, which is pretty revolting. And the house is known as the place where Lord Baden-Powell, founder of the Boy Scouts and Victorian hero and icon, where he grew up as well. And by chance, or maybe it was not a coincidence, he and I both attended the most vile, wretched prep school on the face of the planet in Tunbridge Wells, the Rose Hill Preparatory School for Boys. My father was the writer Tahir Shah, and I've written about him in quite a lot of my work. And I've drawn attention to the fact that when I was a child, Langton House and the goings on there, the people coming and the people going, and the festivities and the parties and the lectures and the all kinds of stuff, it all seemed so normal to me. It seemed so normal, in fact, that I assumed everyone else lived in huge white houses, huge mansions with forests and fields and stables and all kinds of hidden secret corners to play in. Only later I realized that nobody else I had ever come across had such an extraordinary childhood. And in all kinds of ways, and now I look back at it, I see that my childhood at Langton House prepared me for a life that is all about embracing the full spectrum of experience. To me, as everyone who knows me knows, and my poor children, Ariane and Timur, are massively aware, I see the human experience as kind of as a radio dial, and I always note to my kids and everyone else that a lot of people live on one frequency. They're tuned in to one radio station, whereas I'm all about maybe abundance, but I'm all about checking out every possible station on the network and beyond. My father, Idris Shah, had started an institute called the Institute for Cultural Research not long after I was born, or maybe even just before. And ICR, as it was known, brought together all kinds of people, some of them famous, but most of them not, people from all kinds of backgrounds. I'm just thinking right now, there was a guy from the rag trade, there was a barrister, there were writers, there were artists, there were theatrical directors, there were architects, there were plumbers, there was a car mechanic, and all kinds of other people, all thrown together in what I actually think was a kind of crucible. It was this, it was, I would say that it was a pot, but it was just a crucible whereby in which people could come together and experience the same thing and learn from each other, but experience it possibly in different ways, depending on their backgrounds. every evening, every Saturday evening at Langton House, a meal would be served, and members of the Institute would come down, and the meal was served in a building which always seemed so normal to me. It was called the Elephant, and it was a stone stable, kind of crossed with a barn, and it was just outside the main house. And usually the food was quite ordinary and not fabulous, and about 30 people would eat. Once in a while, an extraordinary meal would be cooked up by a gentleman called Monsieur René Lecoux, and he was one of the finest chefs in France, and he was born, at about the turn of the century. I loved him, and he could be given a couple of old potatoes and a couple of cabbages and turn out a gigantic feast for everyone. And after the meal, my father, not always, but would often begin to talk and say whatever was on his mind. It was a kind of banter, really, and it wasn't planned. What I realized later was that my father's his attention to detail was extraordinary, and so what he had always did was note down who was there and what he had said and the effect it had had on them. Nobody there ever realized that, and I only realized it after my father's death when I was looking through his notes. And it was this crucible every weekend, every Saturday night, that enabled him to try out material, a little bit like a chef, I guess, and to see what effect particular stories or ideas or suggestions had on them. And what was so important to him was that his crucible, his people, the Institute for Cultural Research, was a total random deck of people, because he didn't want his books to be read only by academics. He wanted them to be explored by all kinds of people, and for the work that he was doing to be understood by lots of different people from various backgrounds. So that's why there was such a variety of people. But I'm digressing because I'm supposed to be talking about my childhood. I don't know why, but Langton House, although it had so many bedrooms and was so huge, I was put at the age of about 7 up in the attic. It was far from the other bedrooms in the house, far from where my parents and my 2 sisters slept. And I think my parents thought I would have lots of space up there. I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified out of my wits. And I never got over the fear of being in the attic room. It's sort of silly to talk about it now, but it's something that I live with. And I always thought there was a monster living under my bed. And in my book, Travels with Nasruddin, I describe how my father gave me Nasruddin because as a protector, because I was so terrified of the monsters under my bed. So I lived up there in the attic, and I would never walk up there when everyone went to sleep or when we children went to bed. I would always run at top speed, and then I'd leap from near the door across my bedroom onto my bed, terrified that the monsters would get me. And elements of childhood slip into our adult lives. And as far as I see it, my childhood, the fear of the monsters, that in a way led me to a fascination with imagination and with jinns and all kinds of other parameters and possibilities. When I was 8 years old, as I said, I went to this prep school in the local town called Tunbridge Wells, and I've written about it. Again, I think in Travels with Nasruddin, there was a particular teacher who hated me, and he was from Rhodesia. who really hated me, and he made my life an absolute hell. I can't even lay it on thick enough how for 6 years or so he punished me and lambasted me and tortured me. If anyone did that sort of thing to a child now in the Western world, they'd be carted off to jail. But this man, he got away with it. And rather than be angry or, bereft, I decided that I would be grateful to him. Yes, it took time, but in every way, I'm massively grateful to that man because he helped me conjure something that is so important to me. It is a sense of imagination. While he was punishing me and screaming at me like a sergeant major, I would tune out and look out the window, and I would dream of kingdoms and warrior princes and genies and dragons and all kinds of amazing things. So I have that man to thank for my imagination. After my childhood, I think I was about 22, 23, Langton House was sold, and something that I've never really recovered from because it was so important to me. I dream of it every night. I dream of climbing the yew tree, the huge yew tree in the garden, and I dream of the monkey puzzle tree that I adored so much. I dream of sharpening sticks in the forest outside the house and the bluebells in that forest. And I dream of all kinds of fantastic escapades. I think, like everyone, I cling hold to my childhood and take security from it and a sense of self from what was impossible to understand at the time. I mean, when I think back, and there were people like Doris Lessing and, Robert Graves and Salinger and others coming and going, it all seemed totally normal. And I think that's what the ultimate magic of my childhood was. It was this bizarre, extraordinary crucible of people, ideas, and inspirations. But it was something that could really only be understood decades after it had ceased. So that, my friends, is my childhood.